September 17, 1862. Before the sun even rose, a quiet Maryland farm town found itself at the absolute center of America's future. By the time night fell, more Americans would be lost in a single day of combat than on any other day in the nation's history. And yet, most people today can't even name this battle. This was the Battle of Antietam, the fight that quietly, almost secretly, changed America forever. It wasn't the largest battle of the Civil War. It certainly didn't end the war. But what happened on that single brutal day forced the United States to finally decide what kind of country it was going to become. The answer to that question would be written in blood. By 1862, the Civil War had already dragged on far longer than anyone, North or South, had expected. In the Union, the initial belief was that the conflict would be swift, a quick suppression of a rebellion. In the Confederacy, the conviction was that their independence was inevitable. Both sides were profoundly wrong. Coming off a string of stunning Southern victories, the brilliant Confederate General Robert E. Lee decided to make an incredibly bold move. He would take the war north, marching his army into Union territory for the first time. His goal was audacious and deeply risky. First, win a major, decisive victory on Union soil. Second, use that victory to convince foreign powers like Britain and France to officially recognize and support the Confederacy. And third, completely shatter the morale of the Northern public, forcing them to sue for peace. If Lee succeeded, the war might very well be over, and the Confederacy would be born. President Abraham Lincoln knew this. The Union Army knew this. The stakes could not have been higher. As dawn broke over the rolling Maryland hills, the battle began in the most mundane of places, a simple cornfield owned by a farmer named David Miller. Thousands of Union soldiers from General Joseph Hooker's corps began to advance, marching shoulder to shoulder, their blue uniforms stark against the green stalks. They were marching blind, unable to see the Confederate soldiers waiting for them just beyond the tall rows of corn. Within minutes, the peaceful field erupted into total chaos. Artillery shells tore through the corn, shredding men and plants alike. Muskets fired at point-blank range. Units surged forward, only to be cut down and forced to fall back. Then another wave would advance, pushing the enemy back before being repulsed themselves. For 3 horrifying hours, that single cornfield changed hands no fewer than 15 times. One soldier later said the field looked as if a giant, scythe-like hand had swept across it, pressing everything flat to the ground. What made Antietam so different wasn't just the strategy, or the lack of it. It was the sheer scale of the slaughter in such a confined space. Both sides just kept feeding more and more men into the meat grinder, each commander believing that one more push, one more regiment, would finally break the enemy's line. It never did. It just created more casualties. By midday, the vortex of the fighting shifted south, toward a narrow, sunken farm road that had been worn down over years of wagon traffic. This unassuming lane would soon earn a new, infamous name, Bloody Lane. Confederate soldiers, under General D.H. Hill, took up a defensive position in the road, using its low banks as a natural trench. From this protected position, they could pour a devastating fire into any Union forces trying to attack across the open field in front of them. For nearly 4 hours, Union divisions threw themselves against this Confederate stronghold, time and time again. The attacks were brave but disjointed. Commanders on the field hesitated. Orders were delayed or misunderstood. Critical opportunities to coordinate and overwhelm the defenders were missed. And that hesitation, those small moments of indecision, mattered immensely. Because this fight was no longer just a tactical struggle for a piece of ground. It was becoming a moral turning point, a testament to human endurance and futility, all at once. Finally, a Union breakthrough at one end of the line allowed them to fire down the length of the road, turning the Confederate sanctuary into a death trap. The line broke, but at a terrible cost. As the afternoon wore on, the focus of the battle shifted once again, this time to a picturesque triple-arch stone bridge crossing Antietam Creek. It would later be known as Burnside's Bridge. Union General Ambrose Burnside's the Ninth Corps was tasked with crossing this bridge to strike the Confederate right flank. It was a crucial objective. But holding the high, wooded ground on the opposite bank were just a few hundred Confederate riflemen from Georgia. They had a perfect field of fire. For hours, Burnside's much larger force tried to storm the narrow bridge. Each attempt was met with a hail of gunfire and driven back with heavy losses. Time was slipping away. Lee was barely holding on, and a successful Union push here could have collapsed his entire army. When Union soldiers finally managed to wade the creek and outflank the defenders, forcing them to abandon the bridge, it was already late in the afternoon. Burnside's men regrouped and began their advance, but by then, crucial Confederate reinforcements had arrived on the field at the last possible second, blunting the Union assault. And just like that, with both armies exhausted and battered beyond belief, the daylight began to fade. The fighting sputtered to a halt. As night fell over the fields and woods of Sharpsburg, a strange and eerie silence descended. The guns were quiet, but the fields were filled with the cries of thousands of wounded men. Both armies remained on the field, battered but not broken. There was no clear winner. No decisive collapse of one side or the other. Tactically, it was a draw. But strategically, something profound had changed. Lee's army, having suffered crippling casualties, had no choice but to withdraw. The next night, under the cover of darkness, his exhausted troops slipped back across the Potomac River into Virginia. For the very first time, the seemingly invincible Confederate advance into the North had been stopped cold. And that halt, that bloody stalemate, gave President Abraham Lincoln the political opening he had been desperately waiting for. You see, for months, Lincoln had been wrestling with a monumental decision. He had already drafted a document, the Emancipation Proclamation, which would declare enslaved people in the rebellious states to be, henceforward and forever free. But he and his cabinet knew he couldn't release it while the Union Army was losing. It would look like a desperate, last-ditch effort, a cry for help rather than a position of strength. He needed a victory. Antietam was not the clean, crushing victory he had hoped for, but it was enough. Lee's army was in retreat. The immediate threat to the Union had been turned back. Just 5 days after the battle, on September 22nd, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. With that single act, the entire purpose of the war was redefined. This was no longer just a war to preserve the old Union. It was now, officially, a war to end slavery and create a new Union, a nation dedicated to freedom. This had massive consequences. It immediately made it almost impossible for European nations, like Britain and France, which had already abolished slavery, to intervene on behalf of the slave-holding Confederacy. It gave the North a powerful moral cause that re-energized the war effort. And most importantly, it set America on a new path, reshaping its future forever. Antietam didn't end the Civil War, not by a long shot, but it redefined why it was being fought. The human cost of that redefinition is almost impossible to comprehend. In just 12 hours of fighting, over 22,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or went missing. That's more casualties than in all of America's other wars in the 19th century combined. More than D-Day in World War II. Families waited for letters that would never arrive. Entire towns, north and south, felt the devastating impact of the losses from that one day. And yet, over time, the Battle of Antietam has faded into the background of our history. It's overshadowed by the grander scale of Gettysburg or the finality of Appomattox. Not because it didn't matter, but because its greatest impact wasn't a dramatic battlefield victory. Its impact was quiet. It was political. It was moral. Antietam wasn't a battle about glory. It was a battle about consequence. It was the brutal, bloody day that forced a nation to look in the mirror and confront what it truly stood for, and what it could no longer tolerate. America didn't just fight a battle that day, it made a choice. And that choice, made on the banks of a small creek in Maryland, continues to shape the country we live in today. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story meaningful, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into the moments that made us who we are. We'll see you next time.